Bill, great to have you on our show.
Well, it's good to be on your show.
You have written a book that's raising a lot of eyebrows. Here it is. One If by Land, What Every American Needs to Know About Our Border. What do you think is different about your book than some of the others that have been written?
Well, I think one important difference is the viewpoint presented in the book. In particular, the book started out with a pretty simple idea, and that was that for years the ranchers on the border had experienced the consequences of an open border and the tsunami of illegal immigration and drug trafficking. They experienced all that firsthand, and they were shocked by it. Their lives were impacted by it, and they had generally they had this thought that if only the public knew about what was happening on the border, that it would change things, that the events would become so important to the public that things would change. And so for years, the ranchers, it's really interesting, for years the ranchers made an attempt to talk to anybody about the situation on the border that would listen. And they wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to politicians, to the president, to senators, to representatives, to agency heads, anybody they thought that could help with the situation, because they thought it was serious and they thought it was important, and it was more than just impacting their lives. They feared for the country's security also.
Right.
So that happened, and that's what happened after that was the book was intended to give a voice to those ranchers. And I began interviewing those ranchers, and we started presenting their stories. But in addition to that, other people then came forward, people in government agencies like the Border Patrol, ICE, the DEA, the Justice Department, security, all kinds of people came forward and started to share their stories also. So the book then became what you see today and what's available to the reader.
Well, and what you get out of the book is, you said, and I know I've talked with some of these ranchers and farmers that live near the border myself, but they try to tell their story and nobody would listen. And you talk about how they would go to these meetings and they would bring pictures with them and say, can you help us out? And they'd actually have an incident at their house going on and call the Border Patrol, can you come? And what was their response?
Their response was, well, they would get several responses. You would get a response, well, we don't have anybody available right now. Or they would respond 2 or 3 hours after the phone call, or they'd go to the wrong address, or all kinds of things. Essentially, the Border Patrol was not giving and providing hardly any security to the ranchers.
No, and then as your book points out, not only that, but they told them, don't take pictures of what you're seeing. And if that doesn't say they didn't want anybody, I mean, Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano goes down there and says the border is safe. So they didn't want the pictures to show just the opposite.
Well, exactly, because that was to one rancher that was an especially stunning thing. He wanted to just take pictures. He had helped the Border Patrol catch some illegals on his property, and he wanted to get a picture of it, and they prevented him from doing that. One of the things that's understanding what's going on with all of this is important is that the Border Patrol and these agencies are super sensitive about their image. And then sometimes the public relations becomes much more important to them than the actual mission they're supposed to be fulfilling. So they try to control the message and make sure that the public has just the information they want provided to them.
But, Bill, don't you find, and as your book points out, along with the image, it was also, if it doesn't support our agenda, we don't want to know about it?
Exactly. I think that most of the policies of these, like the Border Patrol, ICE, ATF, they're political agendas, and they're not necessarily law enforcement agendas. And that's reinforced. They enforce that political agenda on the employees and agents, because your promotions are based on how well you meet the political agenda, not how well you achieve law enforcement goals.
Or protect the public. And there's a part in your book, it's called The Culture of Lies. And you've actually talked to people on the inside who talk about how the numbers of immigrants, illegal immigrants, and drug smugglers coming across the border, it's actually been rigged.
Yeah, and most and a lot of insiders have told me most of the so-called facts and numbers that come out of these agencies, and the Border Patrol in particular, are rigged numbers. I mean, I talked to one former high-ranking member of the Border Patrol, and he said the border is just about as secure as the government wants it at any particular time, and they'll rig the numbers to reflect, that degree of security. So. And then it's done in a lot of ways, and I don't know if you're interested in how some of the ways they rig the numbers, but
sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, one of the ways is the way they deploy their forces. For example, the Border Patrol will sometimes deploy agents in areas where there is known low traffic, so the numbers will be low that are reported. Well, and agents will say, I know I'm in a place where there won't be much activity, but I know that, 2 miles down the road, they've come through that fence 3 times in the last week or something. And so things get rigged that way by deployment. And you also notice that the current strategy on the border, actually on the border, if you go down to the border itself, you'll find very few agents by that fence down there on the border. But you go back 20 or 30 miles, and you'll find a lot of agents, roaring down the highways. So the forces are deployed so that they're not where they would do the most good.
Well, and also in your book, you talk about, was it poor performance by the Border Patrol due to incompetence or intentional? And as you point out, this isn't just the Border Patrol. It runs through the ATF. It runs through many federal agents. What is your, is it incompetence or is it intentional?
Well, I think there's a lot of intent behind what appears to be incompetence. For example, there's going back to the Border Patrol for a minute. They want to make it look like their apprehension levels are high, so they tell their agents not to report getaways. In fact, Sheriff Larry Deaver was told that last year that by a senior supervisor that the agents weren't supposed to report to getaways. And that way their apprehensions looked really good while you didn't have any idea of how many people actually were going through the border. So there are things like that they control the numbers with and control the level of enforcement. They pretty much have control over how much goes through that border, and there are reasons that they don't want it shut down, in my opinion.
Yes. And people need to know this book is not just about the border. You also go into the tragic murder of Brian Terry. And, I thought it was fascinating that one of the veteran agents that you interviewed said the final story about the Brian Terry shooting, the way it took place, will bear little resemblance to what actually happened. That in itself is tragic and the reason why the Terry family continues to push for the truth.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important story because, in a sense, I have the belief. They say in law enforcement that the most complicated, huge case inside that is one case that's trying to be seen. And in this situation, I think with Fast and Furious, it's really the Brian Terry murder. Mm-hmm. I think that that agent that told me about how he thought that would finally be resolved and what it would look like with very little resemblance to the truth of what happened. And I think he's absolutely right because that story has morphed since the very first, and it doesn't resemble what it originally was and what I think it was.
It's just amazing, and really it is a fascinating book because you have talked to so many insiders. And I'm sitting there, reading the book, and I'm thinking to myself, you've got Napolitano, she continues, and Obama, oh, how safe it is. And then the head of the Tucson sector for the Border Patrol, Chief Richard Barlow, admits to you, we have not made a dent in the criminal organizations coming across the border. You were just down at the border. Do you agree that nothing's much has improved?
Yeah, in fact, I think one important thing is things have changed on the border. For example, there aren't as many illegal immigrants coming across right now, though they still come across, and I've seen where they've come across recently. but that's mostly a factor of the economy. And what that's done is, in the past, the huge volume of legal immigrants has disguised the intensity of the drug trafficking that comes across that border. And now that that's gone, when you go down to the border, you can really see how extensive the drug trafficking is. Like, I've been down there lots recently. I've been on the border the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've witnessed where loads have gone through. I've witnessed where they go during the winter, or during the monsoon season, they have these huge floodgates that they open in the washes, and they're big enough to drive a large-sized pickup truck through. And those are often, though they protest and say they aren't, they're often left unguarded, and loads will come through those big gates. Mm-hmm. And I know where the gates are. I've witnessed the aftermath. You can see the tire tracks. I mean, there's a lot of drug trafficking coming through that fence down on the border.
So here's your book, and you hear Napolitano say the border's safe. What do you want Americans to know?
Well, I want them to know that the border is not secure. It is very unsafe. It's not. There's a lot of crime down there that directly relates to the open border policy, and that what Napolitano says is not true. It is absolutely not true in any way, shape, or form.
And the bigger picture is a threat to all of our national security. All of us are at risk.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. And that's, again, with the reduction in illegal immigration, that becomes much more apparent, because it's as easy for a pickup truck to come through there with a weapon of mass destruction as it is with a ton of dope in the back of it. And the truth is that could happen anytime anybody wanted that to happen. Most of the loads make it through the border.
But you're concerned, and you want people to know about it.
Yeah, I do want them to know about that. And I think that one thing to understand about the border and why it is left open, and because it is an intentional political choice that it is open, is that the government of Mexico is engaged in the drug trade with the cartels. In fact, Mexico itself is so dependent upon the income that for the gross domestic product that comes from the drug trade that they could not afford to end the drug trade even if they wanted to, which they don't.
And that is fascinating, because in your book you talk about how Mexico can't afford to win this war.
Yeah, the conflict in Mexico essentially is a conflict that determines who controls the drug trade and not to end the drug trade. Because if they ended the drug trade, the economy of Mexico would be in dire straits. And I think one of the things that's important about that is Anthony Coulson, who was the head of the DEA drug efforts in southern Arizona for almost 10 years, said that the war on drugs in Mexico is a sham and a charade.
Yep.
There's no way that we can go down there and end that or have an influence on that to end that drug industry down there.
Well, our this is an administration that apologizes for our Second Amendment. The facts are clear. They just don't want to know them.
Well, exactly.